Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Tyra and Bjorn by Celeste Barclay, narrated by Paul Woodson. Prologue. 10 years ago. Tyra Vigosdottir extended her arm to Bjorn Jansson and jerked him from the ground where she had just knocked him onto his backside. She slid her foot under the hilt of his sword and kicked it until her hand wrapped around the handle. She handed it back to Bjorn with a smirk.
"Maybe one day you'll be able to keep up. Today isn't that day,"
Tyra goaded. They had been sparring once more, and the result was typical. Tyra knocked Bjorn onto his arse time and again, despite being a woman 2 years younger and only coming to the middle of his chest. They had been sparring since they were children, and at 17 Bjorn resented Tyra, who was only 15, still being able to best him. He was a renowned warrior in his own right, but somehow Tyra knew him better than he knew himself. She was always at least 1, but usually 3 moves ahead of him. Before Bjorn could thank her, she spun on her heels and marched away, her honey-blonde braids swinging down her back. Bjorn grimaced as he recalled the loathing he had seen in her eyes as they fought. For the longest time there had been a teasing glint as she bested him, but for the last 3 moons there had been anger and disgust. He accepted that he deserved it, but it still stung. He moved to the side of the training ring and stepped into the shadows as he took a long draw from his water skin. He watched as Tyra spoke to their friend Strian. Bjorn wanted to grimace at the sight of Strian and Tyra together, but he knew it wasn't Strian's fault. Bjorn's mind wandered to when his friendship with Tyra ended 3 moons ago. Bjorn remembered as though the events were happening before his eyes. The early spring weather was unseasonably warm, and after training Bjorn looked for Tyra as he usually did. He didn't make a habit of talking to her or standing near her, but having been in love with her since he was 7, he was always drawn to her. When he was unable to find her, but spotted his cousins Leif and Freya, he wondered where Tyra had disappeared to. She and Freya were best friends and rarely apart, so he made his way to his cousins as he looked around. "You seem to be missing your other half," he grinned at Freya.
"Tyra was hot and wanted time to soak, so she went to the fjord."
"Alone?" Bjorn's heart began to race. Tyra was a force to be reckoned with when she was armed, but she would be vulnerable while undressed and alone. "Why didn't you go with her?"
"She said she wanted some time to herself."
Freya shrugged.
"We aren't one person. We do things alone."
Bjorn grunted as he walked to the tree line, then ran until he spotted the fjord to his left. He slowed his pace, cautious not to make his presence known in case someone did lurk within the trees, watching Tyra. He drew his sword as he approached the shore. He scanned the area but couldn't hear nor see anyone else. His chest was tight with alternating pangs of fear and anger for Tyra's foolishness. He sheathed his sword and waded into the water. He had seen Tyra's blonde head at the surface as she soaked the rest of her body. She spun around with a knife pointing at him when she heard his splashes. Tyra's eyes opened wide as she took in Bjorn standing knee-deep in the water with a look of fury on his face. She had seen him angry countless times, his wrath usually directed at her for beating him, but this rage was far more intense than she had seen before. Bjorn's mind screamed that his chest and cock would detonate simultaneously as both throbbed. He had been with more than one woman, and he had seen different body types over the years, but he had seen nothing as beautiful as the water nymph who stood before him. She was exquisite, with long legs and slender hips. She had broad shoulders and muscles from years of training. Her breasts weren't as large as those that usually drew him, but they would easily fill his hands. He forced his eyes from the thatch of dark hair that protected the place he most wanted to be at that moment.
"Bjorn?"
Her hushed tones barely carried to him. He didn't respond except to continue walking toward her as he pulled his fur cloak from his shoulders. He stopped just inches before her and swung it around her shoulders before pulling her into his embrace. "What were you thinking?" Tyra didn't miss the real distress in his voice. "Why would you come here alone?"
I wanted time to think.
"About what? What could be so important that you would allow yourself to be vulnerable? You might have a knife, but what if there had been more than one man, and you're already naked?" His voice hitched as he squeezed his eyes shut to banish the image forming in his mind. He was certain he might be ill if he allowed his imagination to envision her being assaulted.
I needed to think how I felt about someone.
A crushing weight descended upon Bjorn's shoulders as he scooped Tyra into his arms and walked to the shore. "Who?" he grunted. Tyra's blue-hazel eyes gazed into Bjorn's brown ones. They had looked each other in the eyes countless times. After all, they had known each other since Tyra's birth. This time, the electricity fired between them.
"You,"
she mouthed, no sound coming out, despite her effort. Bjorn lowered her to the ground as he brushed away the hair sticking to her neck. He lifted the soaking strands from beneath his cloak. "Me? What were you thinking?" His voice came out barely more than a whisper as his breath brushed across Tyra's nose and cheeks.
"That you would never hold me as you are now."
Tyra smiled, but was unable to look at Bjorn, instead staring over his shoulder. She shocked herself that she'd just admitted that aloud. He had just seen her naked, and now she was confessing that she desired him. She had never been so exposed. Then we are opposites in yet another way. My mind can't stop thinking of finding ways to stand as we are now. He brushed the back of his fingers across her cheeks. "Tyra, you frightened me coming here alone. I can't bear anything happening to you. Do you not realize how precious you are?" Tyra had no answer for that question. She hadn't felt precious since her parents died. She swallowed several times as she tried to keep the lump in her throat from choking her. "Oh, Tyra," Bjorn murmured before his mouth descended to hers. His kiss was soft as he didn't want to scare her. He wasn't blind to the fact she'd kissed other boys before, having seen it more than once. He nearly tore each boy apart as he struggled to contain his jealousy. He also was aware she could feel the hard ridge within his leather pants. She opened her mouth and swiped the tip of her tongue against the corner of his lips. Bjorn dove in, needing no further invitation. He cradled her head as he tightened his hold around her waist. She mewled as his tongue tangled with hers, and her hands ran over his chest to his shoulders before weaving into the hair at his nape. She pressed her body against his as his cloak slid open. Her breasts caught between them, the tight peaks that were her nipples puckered from the cold water and desire. His hand roamed up her ribs until he swept his fingers along the side, and at her moan he pressed it between them. He groaned as his hand filled with her supple flesh. His cock continued to strain against his pants, but his conscience strained too. "Tyra, we have to stop." Bjorn pulled away.
"Why?"
It was her turn to question him.
"I've coveted this for so long, it's unreal that I'm standing here with you."
She dropped her head as her hair cloaked her face.
"I never imagined you would ever want me,"
she stated with honesty that tore at Bjorn. "I've wanted you for as long as I can remember." Her honesty deserved the same from him.
"Then don't stop. Bjorn, be my first."
Bjorn wanted to yell that he would be her only, but he wasn't ready to make such pledges. He looked into Tyra's eyes, earnestness filling them. It wasn't just the heat of passion, but a steady gaze. There was nothing he desired more in that moment than to introduce Tyra to making love, initiating her into the pleasures of the flesh. He drew his cloak from her shoulders and laid it on the ground. Tyra lowered herself onto the fur as Bjorn undressed, careful to keep his sword unsheathed and within reach. He wouldn't risk her safety. He kneeled between her legs as she reached for him. He rested on his forearm as his hand traveled to the juncture of her thighs. He nearly spilled when he discovered how ready she was to welcome him. His fingers moved as he watched her cheeks flush. As her body crested, he thrust into her. She clenched around him, her inner muscles along with her thighs and arms. He drew out the moment until they both were beyond the point of rational thought. "Look at me, Tyra."
"I want to, but it's too much. I can't keep my eyes open, Bjorn,"
she moaned at the end. Bjorn pulled himself loose at the last moment, bending his head to kiss Tyra once more. It was the most tender kiss he had ever shared. They spent another 2 hours on the beach as he introduced her to other ways in which they might share their attraction. When they accepted they shouldn't remain away from the homestead any longer, Bjorn led her to the wall and watched as she went to her aunt and uncle's longhouse. Bjorn hadn't been this light-hearted since before his parents died when he was 5. He was excited to see Tyra the next morning, but he spotted her standing at the door of Strian's home. They were locked in a tight embrace. Bjorn's world fractured around him as he blinked. He watched as they broke apart and spoke. He tried to resign himself to seeing the woman he loved with his best friend, but he couldn't. They trained as usual that day, but he avoided Tyra while they were on the field. He saw her confusion, but he struggled to be near her. When 2 other shield maidens, Helga and Gunhild, approached him, he welcomed their attention. He agreed to meet them that night, and he was aware Tyra witnessed him with the 2 women. He didn't miss the hurt that flashed across her face as she turned her back on him. That night, Bjorn met both women and went through the motions, but his mind and heart wouldn't move past Tyra. When Tyra arrived at the sparring ring the second morning after what she was convinced had been a life-altering experience, she ran straight into Bjorn's shoulder. He reached out and caught her, but she pushed her hands up as she broke away from him.
"Don't touch me! Don't ever touch me again, you man-whore!"
Bjorn knew he had upset her, but he hadn't imagined she would push him away. "Pardon me, you wouldn't want Strian to see you."
"Why would he care?"
"I saw you with him yesterday. I guess now that you're broken in, you are ready to move on." Bjorn was unprepared for the fist that ploughed into his face, nor was he ready for the next one that came under his chin. He reached for his nose, opening his belly for the punch that landed there. As he bent low, Tyra grasped his shoulders and drove her knees into his calves.
"You ass! Yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of our parents' death. We were consoling one another."
Bjorn's look of shock was comical, but Tyra was so revolted by him that she found no humor in his realization.
"I hate you, Bjorn Jansen. Perhaps one day I will only mildly dislike you, but right now I wish you were dead."
Tyra ran away, and Bjorn tried to go after her, but the pain, physical and emotional, doubled him over. Chapter 1. Present Day. Bjorn watched Tyra as she trained with Freya. He had been watching her like a hawk for the past several months. For years he had a sixth sense when it came to Tyra, always knowing where she was, but an enemy injuring her in a battle against Håkon Håkonsson made him even more vigilant. During that battle she saved his life by moving between him and an axe-wielding giant who had already broken his arm. Tyra stabbed the man through the belly, but took the axe to her chest before Bjorn had the chance to push her aside and sink his blade into the giant's chest. If Tyra hadn't protected him, Bjorn would be dead, rather than watching over her like a nursemaid. He would admit that she impressed him with her improvements in such a short time. It had been 4 moons since her injury, and she was nearly back to full strength. He watched her sweep her leg against Freya's knees and flip his cousin over her shoulder. Freya rolled and came back to her feet as she swung her shield, pushing Tyra back several steps. Both women locked swords as they bared their teeth at one another. Tyra brought her shield up between them as Freya hacked her sword into the side of Tyra's shield, where it lodged. Freya head-butted Tyra's forehead. Both women threw down their swords and shields and launched themselves at one another as they rolled on the ground. There was no way to keep up with who had the advantage as their positions changed. A smile emerged as he watched the 2 women go from baring their teeth and hissing at one another to smiling, then giggling as they tangled together. "It's nice to hear my wife laugh. There were a few months when I thought she didn't know how. Eric Ragnvaldsson mused as he watched Freya pin Tyra to the dirt. Bjorn's upper body lurched forward, but he forced himself not to take a step forward. He waited a heartbeat, then relaxed when Tyra's knee pushed Freya from her. We also thought Freya had forgotten how to laugh. She may have fallen in love with you, but she certainly appeared not to like you. Bjorn laughed as he turned to look at his cousin by marriage. History has a way of repeating itself, don't you think? Bjorn's laugh died as he glared at Eric. Bjorn and Eric had become friends, and Eric had easily joined Bjorn, Leif, and Strian's tight-knit friendship. It wasn't because Eric married Freya. The bonds of friendship began before that, when they fought against their common enemy, Håkon Håkonsson. I never would have told you about Tyra if you were going to remind me. I prayed you were too drunk to remember what I said. Not nearly drunk enough, but you were definitely drunk enough to make your confessions. But don't worry, they're safe with me. I have said nothing even to Freya, though I'm sure she suspects the truth. During the week of Eric and Freya's wedding celebration, they had all gotten more inebriated than usual. During a drinking binge, Bjorn confessed his feelings for Tyra to Eric as the men watched Freya and Tyra dancing together. Another man cut in to dance with Tyra, and Bjorn had been beside himself. Eric kept him from making a fool of himself by interrupting Tyra's dance. Tyra tolerated Bjorn after years passed and her anger cooled. They had antagonized one another since childhood. Then there had been a period, after their liaison, where Tyra refused to look at him unless they were forced to spar. Bjorn bore several scars from Tyra's resentment. These scars came from the nicks her sword and knife cut, along with the wounds her words caused. His guilt had diminished little over the years, and his regret was his constant companion. Now they still antagonized one another, but the bite wasn't there in Tyra's words or actions. The most recent way they got under one another's skin was about Tyra's recovery. The near-death experience convinced Bjorn that he owed her a life debt. Tyra refused to accept it, saying they were even since he carried her to safety and stayed with her while she was unconscious. Bjorn wanted Tyra to take more care with her return to fighting, and Tyra wanted Bjorn to leave her alone. I would rather no one discussed how I feel about Tyra. I certainly don't want to talk about it. I said all I have to say. Bjorn hoped Eric would take the hint, and when he looked at his friend, Eric nodded. I spoke to Strian this morning. He's gone to the Winter Lodge for the next week. Eric gave Bjorn a pointed look. Bjorn nodded before turning to watch Tyra again. The anniversary of their parents' death is today. Bjorn would never again forget that day. It was that day that changed everything. It was the day he lost the only woman he ever loved. He wanted to speak to Tyra, but this one day of the year seemed to be the most inappropriate for him to go near her. Freya jogged over to them and threw her arms around Eric's neck. Eric, in turn, lifted his wife off her feet and lowered his head for a kiss. The kiss was just like every other one the couple shared, far too long and far too intimate for public. Bjorn tried to look away, but he didn't miss Tyra's attempt to ignore the couple. Her gaze met Bjorn's, and he watched the wall drop in place, just as it did every other time they were near one another. Tyra looked at Eric and Freya, then grimaced. "Since you haven't anything better to do, or no one better to do, let me knock you on your ass a few times." Tyra jutted her chin up as she looked down her nose at Bjorn, an impressive feat since she still came to the middle of his chest. Bjorn felt like a homeless dog, gobbling up any scrap of attention she offered, even if her waspish tongue hurt him. Her biting words never ended, but he was aware he had done little over the years to improve her impression of him. He had lived up to the reputation she accused him of, but it was never for the reason anyone assumed. It was the loneliness that grew from his parents' death that first drew him to his bed partners. Then it was an attempt to forget Tyra. It never made him less lonely, and it never wiped Tyra from his mind. Tyra led the way to the training ring, where they faced one another as Tyra assessed Bjorn. She took in the arm that the enemy broke the day her connection to Bjorn changed for a second time. She would never forget the giant snapping Bjorn's arm like an oatcake, then drawing his sword back to cleave him in half. Tyra would remember forever the mind-numbing fear she experienced as she watched the only man she had ever loved stand next to death. She pushed away in front of him and barely blocked the berserker's axe from cutting her in two, but she wasn't able to stop the blade from sinking into her chest. The wound was deep and broke several bones. Bjorn gained his footing and plunged his sword into their opponent's chest seconds after Tyra drove hers into the man's belly. Tyra slid into unconsciousness with Bjorn's name on her lips. She woke once in his arms as he carried her back to their camp despite his broken arm. She remembered nothing for several weeks after that, except hearing his voice. Once she awoke, Tyra learned that Bjorn had been driven to the point of violence more than once when people suggested he leave her bedside. He claimed it was the blood oath he made to repay the debt he owed. She tried to discharge that debt because she loathed his controlling nature, but he wouldn't relent. As Tyra looked him over again, her strategy was already forming. Their swords engaged as they moved on the offensive at once. Bjorn attempted to use his size and strength to make her knees buckle, but she was more agile than Bjorn. Tyra swung at his shield as she danced away. She reset her stance, then lunged for him again. She lifted her sword to bring it down on Bjorn's weaker arm, which held his shield. When he raised his shield high enough, she used her own shield to swipe across his belly, knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled backwards as Tyra continued her onslaught. Bjorn regained his footing and his breath. As Tyra prepared to swing again, Bjorn twisted sideways to come around her back. She had expected this move and stopped short before swinging. She twisted the other way and brought her shield down toward Bjorn's head. He ducked, giving Tyra the opportunity to lean all her weight forward to push him forward and off his feet. Her momentum, along with Bjorn grabbing her wrist, caused her to follow him to the ground. Bjorn felt her falling and twisted to land beneath her, which meant she sprawled across him. Tyra looked down at the shock in Bjorn's eyes as he lay there with one arm wrapped around her waist. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what?" Tyra was unable to break her gaze. "I didn't mean for you to fall." "That's silly, we were fighting. You should have meant to do more than that." "That's different. I didn't want you to land face down. Not on your chest." Tyra's trance broke at the mention of her injury. "Don't, Tyra. Don't snark at me because I care." Bjorn was aware the words were exactly what he shouldn't have said as soon as they left his mouth. Tyra scrambled to her feet and grabbed Bjorn's hand. She tugged with all her strength and brought him to his feet. Then she spat at his feet. "I don't need or want your protection. I don't need or want anything from you." As he had so many times before, Bjorn watched her storm away. He could have beaten his own head in with his shield. Unlike so many times before, he didn't let Tyra race off, leaving him behind. He followed her as she wound her way through the homestead and out the back wall. He was certain he knew where she was going, and he had a moment of doubt as he followed her to the fjord. He watched her break into a run as she moved further away from their homes. She still carried her sword in her hand, and it relieved him to watch her scanning from side to side. He too carried his sword as he followed her, checking over his shoulder several times. He wanted to yell at her for once more leaving herself vulnerable. All these years later, and she was still wandering off on her own, but now they had an enemy bent on destroying both their tribe and Eric's. She ran to the water's edge, but not where Bjorn expected. The place where she stopped wasn't somewhere she might wade in. Instead, she stopped by a rune of stones, a stone arch with bones laid out beneath it. There was the hilt of a knife Bjorn recognized as her father's, and a comb beside the bones. Bjorn considered for a moment leaving her to the solitude of her parents' memorial, but when she dropped to her knees and sobbed, he refused to abandon her. He watched her shoulders shake as tears streamed down her cheeks. He wanted to wait until her tears abated before he made his presence known. He didn't want to embarrass Tyra in addition to violating her privacy, and he didn't want to add to her list of his transgressions. But as the minutes began to add up, he inched from behind the trees. Tyra was aware Bjorn had followed her, but she needed to escape everyone else's eyes before she collapsed into a puddle of tears. She wished he would leave her alone, so when she heard him approaching, she whipped around with her knife drawn. She came to her feet as she pointed the blade at him.
"Can't you just leave me alone? Just for an hour? Gods, why can't you just stop?"
she choked out. "You know that ever since Håkon Håkonsson started attacking us for Ragnvald and Ivar's homesteads, it's not safe for anyone to leave alone. He's no neighbor to us, and he would love nothing more than to capture one of us. We could assume he bled to death, but Freya severing his arm is no guarantee." Bjorn couldn't hide the frustration from his voice.
"Just because he's been the bane of our lives, no matter how often we fight him, doesn't mean you can't give me some privacy."
Tyra screamed as tears continued to stream down her cheeks. Bjorn sheathed his sword and edged toward her. His heart broke as he watched the woman he not only loved, but admired for her physical and mental strength, fall apart before his eyes. She hadn't cried despite the excruciating pain from her chest wound, but now she stood there looking lost and hurt. When he was within arm's length, he pushed her wrist down, and she didn't resist. He pulled the knife from her hand and dropped it to the ground, pulling her into his arms, and she dissolved. She drew her arms in as she grasped the shirt he wore. He tucked her head against his chest as he rubbed her back and ran his hand over her hair. He said nothing. He had no words, and he was sure nothing would make it better. It had been 11 years since she lost her parents, but Bjorn recognized that the pain was as fresh as if it had just happened. They stood together for what seemed like forever to Tyra, but she couldn't bring herself to pull away. She spent every day in torment, in conflict between her love for Bjorn and her dislike of him. As they stood together, she allowed her love to win out, and she absorbed the comfort he offered. She clung to him as though he was the only thing anchoring her to the earth and keeping her from floating away. She breathed in his pine and musk scent, his muscles flexing as he stroked her back and hair. She listened to his steady heartbeat, which calmed her. She turned so she could press her forehead against his chest. She noticed his semi-aroused rod. A sliver of her mind relished knowing he was still attracted to her. A louder part screamed he was attracted to anything he could slip his cock into, but mostly she was relieved that he just held her. When Tyra lifted her head from his chest at last, Bjorn pressed the same feather-soft kiss to her forehead that he had been scattering on the crown of her head. He said nothing, and she appreciated it. She struggled with what to say, but she knew she should say something.
"This day doesn't get any easier, no matter how many years pass. I'll never forget returning home from that first raid to find my mother and Strian's mother dead. Our people go raiding in Scotland to come home and find our neighbours killed our mothers and Lena lost her last babe. Our people go to avenge the ones we've lost, and Strian and I both lose our fathers. It's so damn unfair."
"I know. Strian goes to the lodge." Bjorn looked out at the water. "When my day comes, I take out a fishing boat and don't return for 2 days. I take enough ale to keep me warm, but not enough to end up drowned." Tyra's hands released his shirt and pressed flat against his chest.
"I forget that you understand what this is like. You never speak of them, so I admit I forget. I realize not talking about them doesn't make it hurt any less."
"It doesn't. I don't have a shrine to them, but I sail out to where my father used to take me when he taught me to fish and sail. It's the same spot where Uncle Ivar and I towed their pyres before sending them to Valhalla. That is my memorial."
"I never found out that's what you did. I've seen you come back drunk, but I always assumed you were doing something else."
Bjorn froze as he looked down at her. You assumed I went to screw on the anniversary of my parents' death. You assumed I dishonoured my parents' memory by thinking only of my own pleasure.
No.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?